Blood of Dragons, Volume 6. The Dead Don't Weep. Chapter 1. The Black Blade. The Battle of the Red Ring, Cyrodiil, Spring, year 175 of the Fourth Era, 27 years earlier. Silent and implacable as the mountains 100 kilometers to the north, the armored figure stood amidst a sea of swaying wheat. It rippled and flowed with a breeze that caressed the stalks, twisting the greenery and rolling and billowing waves that brought the smells of ripening crops, blooming flowers, and the hint of storms. For months, spring had held the land tightly in its grip, but such a grip was loosening in the approach to summer, roasting the soil until it became a fine powder that was crushed underfoot. The spring wheat was ripening, almost ready for harvest, but for now it swayed and flowed around an armoured warrior who stood hip-deep within it. It would have appeared as little more than a statue of metal and leather, an over-protected and expensive scarecrow, if not for the way that a gauntlet caressed through the stalks of grain that surrounded it. Outside of this tiny patch of tranquility, war seethed and devoured, a war that Tamriel had never before seen in its thousands of years of history. Even the great conflicts of the First and Second Eras paled in comparison to the bloodshed and destruction that had raged incessantly for 4 years. Only the Oblivion Crisis had seen such death and conflict, but somehow this war was even more terrible, as it was between the armies of mortals rather than against Daedra kind. The Great War, some were already beginning to call it, as though there could be anything great about the two most powerful empires Tamriel had ever known, caught in the grueling, grinding war of attrition. When it had begun, no one had been overly surprised that the Mede Empire and the Aldmari Dominion went to war. In fact, a lot of those living on both sides were surprised it hadn't begun sooner. Over the 4 years since, however, tens of thousands of lives had been lost, Cyrodiil had burned, and even the majesty of the imperial city had fallen into Aldmiri hands. For kilometers in all directions, the skies were darkened with the thousands of crows and other scavengers, the air increasingly filled with the stench of metal, mud, blood, and shit, and the ground was being pulverized under armored feet. Fields that had once been the lifeblood of thousands were being trampled into destruction, and they would soon be fertilized with the blood of countless men and mer. Master Blade? Grim-faced, forged from the darkest ebony, the scowling Mempo mask and horned Kabuto helm turned slightly, regarding the young Hastati with its cold, metallic gaze. The messenger was young, not even out of his teens, and stood rigidly to attention, arms flat by his sides, and choosing to stare ahead rather than looking at the man visible only through the mask's darkened vision slits. The Emperor requests your presence. Not even the slightest tremble was to be seen from the black-armoured warrior. He stood as quiet as the grave, not moving or flinching, and barely even noticing the enormous formation of legionaries that snaked their way a few meters behind them. The distinct black splint mail, made from dozens of metal strips overlapping each other in traditional Akaviri craftsmanship, set the figure apart from the solid steel plate of the legions. There were many within the Empire that had immense hate towards the warrior's order for their failed part in the war, but despite this, there was a distinct curve in the cohort's path as they chose to march around him, rather than demand he stand aside. The Emperor requests. Another sign, somewhat less subtle than the legions bending their path, but a sign nonetheless. It wasn't as simple or as ludicrous as fear, or a sign of the Order's power and authority. It was a sign of the respect that was given to this member of the Blades. A stalk of wheat was crushed in a gloved fist, breaking it as thoroughly as snapping a spine, and the figure turned on his heel before marching past the cringing messenger. Unseen by all, the young soldier breathed out, releasing the pent-up emotion from standing before the eternal champion of the Mede dynasty. For kilometers in every direction the legions were marching for war, and for the first time in centuries of their long and illustrious history, They had met a foe that they could not simply batter into submission. Under the leadership of 6 centuries of emperors of both the Septim and Mede dynasties, they had held the future of Tamriel in the grasp of an armoured gauntlet. Now they were preparing to besiege the very heart of the empire, but only after bloodily cutting their way through those who currently claimed the imperial city. The camps had been struck, and the hundreds upon hundreds of tents that lined from horizon to horizon had been set aside for the moment as their owners began preparing for battle. Foresters moved through the armoured blocks of cohorts and casters as they took up their positions, stabbing the soil at their feet with bundles of arrows. It wasn't long until the crushed wheat was pounded into a dusty slurry underfoot, and was replaced with a forest of fletchings jutting into the air. 5 ranks deep and 100 wide, enormous blocks of men formed up, their shields locking together into an impenetrable wall of metal and lacquered wood. Caster upon after caster, legion after legion, the tens of thousands of legionaries could feel the earth tremble from their numbers as they arrayed for battle. Stalking through the growing press like a shadow, the black-armoured blade seemed to glide from place to place. He slid between cursing and grunting legionaries as they shuttled forward spare pylons, shields, helmets, and gladii. Others moved about with dozens of sloshing waterskins tied over their shoulders for the inevitable flood of wounded and injured. Especially how the future killing was guaranteed to infect everyone with the most terrible of thirsts. Others carried further bundles of ammunition to the plate-armoured foresters as they transformed from the stealthy skirmishers and hunters into the precise and disciplined archers, their leather and chainmail now thickened with armour plates. Everywhere, in the strange confusion and chaos of the military, a great ballet of logistics and strategy was being conducted, a battle of organisation that needed to be won before the first drop of blood was spilt. Barely a glance was provided to the teams of sweating engineers as they wound and pulled back and prepared enormous siege engines by the blade as he moved by. With enormous bars of metal, they pulled catapult arms down and loaded their varied and deadly projectiles. Windlasses were pulled back, building the tension in the enormous arms of the siege ballistae under the careful eye of their supervising prefects. Even the truly titanic arms of field trebuchets were pulled down, the leather loops and their stones as heavy as an orc were placed into position for the 40-metre arms to whip them in through the sky. And piles of more esoteric ammunition were also being prepared. None of this was truly seen by the stalking blade. His eyes were focused on the sight that lay before him, seated on top of a small hill within the depths of this great army, and where nearly every eye was constantly being drawn back by the weight of expectation. A tent, one among many, but larger, grander, and centrally located as though surveying the hundreds of thousands encamped around it. Unlike the other tents within this grand army of the Empire, this tent was guarded. In the purest purple and silver, the Praetorians stood out against the white tent, but the black-armoured Akaviri warrior was a shadow among purity. Even as he approached, and despite the reverence and respect granted by the wider army, a pair of Hasta spears still clacked into place before the snarling plate helm, the gleaming tips promising blood and violence in the hands of the purple-robed guards. For a moment it was as though the blade would press on, heedless to the warning or the threat implied by the Praetorians, but slowly, as though hunting, the blade stopped and looked one of the guards in the eye. Dressed in his own resplendent plate and the polar opposite of the grim figure before him, the Praetorian shivered, seeing death in their uniquely fashioned armour. The blades had once been the protectors and guardians of the Septim Emperors, and could trace their origins back to the vaunted elite of the Akaviri invasion 2,000 years before. But since the Oblivion Crisis, their roles had changed. No longer were they the bodyguards and protectors, but the true left hands of the Emperor. Spies, agents, and rumoured assassins so capable and feared that the likes of the Dark Brotherhood and Moran Tong kept themselves at a considerable distance. This man, this black-armoured fiend, was a representation of that shadowed order, an order that had been thoroughly decimated in the 4 years of grueling warfare. After all, it had been 133 of their members' severed heads tumbling from a wagon that had set this conflict into motion. There was an exclamation, a pause of breath, followed by a quick reply from within, as one of the Praetorians summoned another man who appeared in the tent's doorway. Dressed in nothing more than a simple toga with signet rings wrapped around his fingers, he found himself staring into the masked blade with none of the fear and unease that his presence usually incurred. Years of dealing with the most powerful men in the Empire left the Imperial representative immune to displays of authority, but there was no mistaking that the silent warrior was unnerving to say the least. The Black Blade was a legend within the Empire, and had been for the past 100 years at least. A legend that most spoke about in whispered tones if they spoke about it at all. There was a nod, and the spears were moved away, allowing the blade to step through without a single word to either of the guards. Inside, the temperature dropped markedly, the several layers of the outer walls allowing the morning cool to remain for hours during the day. Despite this, most of the men and women within the central room were noticeably sweating, and they certainly weren't assisted by the visage of armored death that appeared within their midst. "Ah, you are here." The armored figure bowed, hand clanking to an ebony breastplate over a heart, as the grim, scowling mask and helm lowered their soulless gaze to the floor in respect. Laying in a bed of silken sheets worth more than an entire cohort's equipment, the Emperor, Titus Mede II, lay sweating even more than the dozen individuals around him. Middle-aged, hair slowly turning grey from his years and the stress of the war, he would have normally appeared strong and powerful. Instead, the events during the night had left his body weakened, wrapped in bandages, and being treated by the best healers of the Empire. "Leave us." A hand wrapped in a bandage and faint hints of red slowly blooming under the fabric waved in the general direction of the tent's entrance to the collection of advisors, commanders, servants, and healers, his voice a low murmur of pain. "But, sire, I said leave." Titus's expression was thunderous, and despite the calm, level tone of his voice, the threat that hung to every word was enough to make the sweat flow a little more freely. "I'm now better protected than what I was last night, so get out." Carefully they all bowed, fading from the tent and leaving the Emperor to stare in silence at his champion standing before him. "It is good to see you made it back," Titus said softly, laying back into the plush finery. The grimace that crossed his features was of pain and irritation at having his own body betray him, but there was a smile on his face at the presence of the blade. "Sire." The voice was deep and muffled through the mask. Only the eyes, cold and unfeeling, and the tightly pursed lips could be seen behind the form-fitting mask. Fashioned into the stylized likeness of the ancient Akaviri people, it almost gave the blade a Daedric, yet reptilian appearance. "Don't sire me. I didn't send the others away so you could hide behind formality and protocol." Carefully, a hand pressed into ribs covered by bandages, and Titus groaned as the movement twisted the wounds he had sustained. "And I especially didn't want to be laying here talking to you behind your mask, Kaius." After a moment's hesitation, Kaius reached up, grasping the mask and pulling it away from his face before securing it to his belt. The helmet too was quickly removed, tucked away under an arm and revealing a head covered with short, closely cropped hair, a freshly clean-shaven face that was unsmiling in a way that twisted the horizontal scar under his right eye. Chapter 2. Released Oaths. Silence fell within the tent. The echoing shouts and rolling thunder of thousands of feet on the march muffled slightly through the linen and cloth walls. The battle lines were prepared, and soon it would be time to unleash the full might of the Empire on the invaders. But for the moment there was peace, a sense of comfort in the pending chaos, as the Emperor and his champion looked at each other. "Pity you weren't here sooner. If he had been, I wouldn't have ended up laying here, watching my army run around leaderless. But you managed to survive at least." "Ha, there is that. And that definitely matters to me a lot," But despite everything, you managed to survive as well. Kaius raised his eyes, meeting the Emperor's gaze, and seeing the sadness that mirrored his own. Despite his reputation, Titus Mede II licked his lips nervously at the sight of the warring emotions within the man standing before him. There were few who knew the truth, but the line of the Mede emperors since the founder of their dynasty, his great-great-grandfather Titus Mede I, knew the identity of the Eternal Champion. Most within the Empire believed the Black Blade to be specifically chosen individuals who swore an oath of silence and utter devotion to the Mede Emperors. Those who ruled the Empire knew differently. They knew who he was, and even more importantly, they knew what he was. Are you loyal, Kaius? Of all the questions that Kaius may have been expecting, this was not one of them, shocking the vampiric blade for a moment before he answered. I am. Why? If the first question had been shocking, the second was confusing, and he looked up into the Emperor's features, seeing only the honest yearning for an answer, a curiosity that couldn't be contained. Why am I loyal to you, or why am I loyal to the Empire? I know all too well why you are loyal to the Empire, Titus laughed, before grimacing as he held his side again, where an assassin's blade had scraped ribs. You care about people. A strange trait for a vampire, but you certainly aren't an ordinary one. Kaius said nothing for several long moments, appearing to have as much emotion as a statue, or a Dwemer animunculi. There was, however, a sudden nervousness in the way his face tightened, and he ground his teeth together. I'm loyal to your family because your grandfather helped mine. I used to read his journals, and especially his memoirs when I was younger. The steel blue eyes burned into Kaius's own, and a smile crept onto the Emperor's face. It always fascinated me, the stories that they contained, the way that they had to be kept secured at all times if some of the most potent magic are available to the Empire. Do you know how I reacted the first time I read my grandfather's journals? Kaius shook his head. I sat in my room for the entire night, staring at the open pages before me. I couldn't comprehend it. My family's protector and my teacher wasn't just a vampire. He was the hero of Kvatch and the champion of the Oblivion Crisis. A vampire who could walk in the sunlight, cursed by the blood of a Daedra, and yet blessed with the ability to rule their own destiny. What was even more difficult to comprehend was the immortal being who was outside the influence of the Elder Scrolls had chosen to spend their existence protecting my family. I never read the stories he wrote, Kaius said truthfully, but I remember when I first met him. I fought by his side at Kvatch. Yes, he wrote that in his journals. You made quite the impression on him, even then. You made even more of one when you supported his claim to the throne. It had been in my power to do so as Count. You do realize that taking your family in was his way of repaying you for everything you had done. Titus's smile grew broader, but softened. There was always something disconcerting looking on a man who was nearly 200 and still appeared in his 30s. He would have heaped glories untold upon you and your family, and assured that you would never have to fear again. It is not my way to simply accept charity. No, it is not. But you have to ask yourself, Kaius, why must you continuously pay a debt that you have repaid hundreds of times over? Seeing the darkening expression on his face, Titus just continued, forcing himself to sit upright further from the cushions behind his spine. I am truly sorry for everything that has happened, my friend. I would grant you anything and everything within my power, although I know what you truly wish for, no one has the power to grant, not even an emperor. I desire revenge. With all that I have learned from those memoirs in the last 40 years of your tutelage, I would be terribly concerned if you didn't. His voice softened. I unfortunately know all too well how it is to lose children, even if the circumstances differ between us. The creaking of leather and metal was audible over the background noise of the legions preparing for war, and Kaius's fists clenched so tightly the gauntlets slightly deformed. One hand, trembling and shaking, reached up and surprisingly carefully grasped a worn but cared-for axe and sword pendant hanging around his neck, on its homemade leather loop. Of all the armour and equipment that Kaius was wearing, from the peerless ebony plate armour and the chainmail to the gleaming golden katana at his side, only the amulet of Talos appeared out of place. Cheap, crude, but a source of great sorrow and emotion for the vampiric champion. I have heard it said that the dead do not weep. Watching the surge of emotions as Kaius struggled to contain the overwhelming sorrow that churned within him, Titus's expression turned into one of mirrored sorrow. Even if I knew nothing but your true nature, I would know enough about you to trust you with anything in all of Tamriel. Only the Daedra and the dead do not weep, and I know that my family has been right in trusting you in all these years. It makes the decision that I have to make all the easier, but I have one last task for you, my old friend. There was no surprise in the depths of the cold brown eyes. Sorrow, yes, but not surprise. Kaius had been expecting something like this from the Emperor, but even he was expecting it to be a Vryn riding on the wings of failure instead of gratitude. Shivering, Titus instinctively railed against the cool temperature within the tent as something in the depths of his mind and soul realized the weight of his words carried. It had not been a difficult decision, maybe for his mother perhaps, but Titus knew that it had been a decision made for him 4 years before, when the upturned cart spilled its rotting contents at his feet. Eyeless, swollen and rotting, 133 decapitated heads had been dumped on the steps of the white gold tower, tumbling and staring blankly into the nothingness of death. Kaius had been there, by his side in his role as guardian and representative of the Blades. It was his actions that had given Titus the strength to be able to stare down the Thalmor delegation and make the biggest decision of his life. It had been Kaius, his old teacher of history, military tactics and swordsmanship, and the way that he had bent down over one of the heads that had been more terrifying than the threat of war. Every action had been precise, every movement was smooth and perfect, but Titus alone knew how much raw emotion was coursing through the black-armoured figure. There was no sign of the impossible depths of sorrow that had filled the ancient vampire, growing so great that it breached the veil between sorrow and rage. 133 decapitated heads had lain on the ground, but 132 of them were clothed in rotting flesh. One, and only one, had been unique, that in no flesh remained, revealing only a skull blackened from flames and a pair of incisors that were subtly longer than normal. Titus had watched as Kaius knelt down, carefully picking the skull of a loved one from where it had lain, and he knew at that moment the Aldmeri Dominion had made a terrible enemy. An enemy, it seemed, they were blindly and almost purposely filling with such a terrible hatred and anger that he was fearing for the lives of all mortals within Tamriel. It was only a true, close personal friendship, and through the knowledge of Kaius's incredible humanity, that Titus didn't consider attempting to have Kaius killed. That, and the fact that if 200 years of failed attempts from every beast, man, demi-gods and Daedric princes couldn't kill Kaius, then he doubted anything at an emperor's command would suffice. The Dominion will pay for what they have done. Titus couldn't help but feel the chill of fear as Kaius's features twisted around his skull, pushing forward against his flesh, and his voice was twisted into an inhuman growl. They will, but it will not be the legions or the blades that will succeed in passing judgment. The Dominion is weakened and on the cusp of defeat, but so are we. We have no more strength left to give. The legions are spent, the blades are decimated, and one way or the other the war will end today. You have seen what the Dominion intends to do, and what the Thalmor will do if Cyrodiil and the Empire fall into their hands. I fear that all of this has only been the beginning. They are planning something else, something more terrible than slavery and genocide, and I believe that you, and only you, will be able to stop them. You can't do so from my side, though. You will need to be a free agent for whatever comes next. I will have my own vengeance, whether I have to take my sword from one end of Tamriel to the other, and kill all in my path. You and I know that is not within your nature. The laughter that quickly devolved into a racking, painful cough caused Titus to groan as it pulled on the stitches holding together some of his wounds. "You are a killer, but you're not a murderer." Seeing the cold look in Kaius's eyes, Titus couldn't help but feel the slightest trace of doubt. Holding his murdered son's skull in his hands those years ago had been unravelling the threads of Kaius's humanity, and the more recent loss of his daughter may have come very close to severing them entirely. "I swear, Titus, in my children's names the Dominion will pay. I will not stop until they have been ground into ashes." "Kaius Treblanus Dessen, you are hereby freed of any and all oaths of allegiances to both me and the Empire. You are freed to walk your own path in the service of the men and women of Tamriel. But I have one last final order to give you." The eyes that were consumed with a deep and terrible shadows burned into his own, and Titus shivered again. Somehow it was as though the weight of destiny had been lifted from his shoulders and transferred onto his lifelong friend. But under it all he couldn't help but fear what Kaius could accomplish. And immortal, with the power to influence fate and prophecies, was even more dangerous than the machinations of all the Daedric princes. It was especially even more dangerous than the threat of the Ardmeri Dominion, but fire sometimes needed to be fought with fire. "Give me your order," Kaius said at last, looking Titus in the eye with a face as impassive as the Gerol Mountains. "My friend." Chapter 3. Imperator. Dressed in his gilded armour of gleaming gold, silver, and ebony, the Emperor strode from the depths of the tent, dressed in the lavish plate armour that had been passed down for generations. Every inch of metal was etched in gold, the silver sheen of the steel competing with the gold for dominance, and it was almost as though the sun grew slightly brighter in the sky. Flanked by a pair of seasoned legates, not one of the thousands of soldiers who witnessed the appearance of the Emperor noticed that the Praetorian Guard were nowhere to be seen. Nor did they see the unease shared by those closest to the Emperor. The battle formations had been drawn, arrayed in rows 10 or 15 legionaries deep across the rolling hills and farmlands to the north of Lake Rumier. Between the deep waters surrounding the city isle and the 2-kilometre-wide mass of heavy Imperial infantry awaited their enemy, similarly arranged for battle. An ancient golden funeral mask of the first Mede Emperor, framed by its sturdy golden helm, looked over a sea of expectant faces as the Emperor walked amongst his soldiers once more. Rumours of the attempted assassination during the night had swept the army like wildfire, and some of the legionaries had their courage hanging by threads, dreading what similar fate would await them on the battlefield. The sight of their Emperor standing, dressed in the full panoply of war, sent a ripple of cheers through the massed ranks. "General Tullius, are the men ready?" the Emperor called, picking out the red-cloaked figure standing in a group of the highest-ranked officers present. "Yes, sire." Grey hairs had begun to appear, but a lifetime of wearing a helmet had begun receding the general's hairline at an earlier age. The salute, though, was perfect and precise, even as Tullius ran his fingers comfortingly along the hilt of his well-used gladius. "The 1st through the 12th legions are arrayed and ready." "Good." Slowly, precisely, the gleaming golden katana attached to the Emperor's side was drawn, a gloved thumb testing its edge for keenness, while those nearest shared looks of concern among themselves. Such a weapon and its origins would be a mystery to most, but there were few who knew that such a weapon would never need anything as mundane as sharpening. "What word have we received from the other armies?" "General Junna has engaged Ardmeri hosts to the east and the Nordic and Vardenfell legions. The assault is going well, and they are driving the Elven Armonias before them." "And General Decanius?" A finger pointed to the west, where several dozen kilometres distant an enormous black mass slithered from the edge of the great forest. From their position in the hills and rolling plains in southern Elswell barony, and despite the distance, a rolling cheer lifted up from the massed ranks of the Cyrodiilic legions. The full might of the Mede Empire was advancing from the west, north, and east onto the imperial city and the elven armies defending it. Never had such numbers been arrayed for battle. 38 legions from across the empire marched in 3 enormous formations that were each several kilometers wide, crushing all in their path, whether it was their dominion foes or the likes of farms and forests. From the 1st Legio Cyrodiilica to the 38th Legio Cineris Eucidae from Hammerfell, the shores and plains surrounding the imperial city and Lake Rumere shuddered at their approach. Their foes, however, awaited them, in equal numbers, prepared along the shores and within the enormous circular city built in the centre of the lake. They were rows upon rows of black and golden armoured warriors drawn from across the Dominion, from the Caesiate Foederati in their lamella plate, to the gleaming moonstone armoured corps of Ultima and Metanetinoi lamella of pikemen. The heartlands of Cyrodiil had never felt the presence of such armies before, even during the bloodiest days of the Three Banners War in the Second Era, or the Oblivion Crisis at the end of the Third. Expectation weighed upon all those present, from the hardened veterans who had survived 4 years of bloody conflict, to the fresh recruits, finding themselves taking part in their first battle. None could deny the importance of such the day. Iactus ultimus alle. Those nearest to the Emperor heard him speak softly to himself as he spoke, one last throw of the dice in ancient Cyrodiilic. More than one of the assembled legates, tribunes, and military advisers and support staff looked among themselves at the strangeness of the tone. Only a small handful of the most trusted among their number knew the truth, but their fears and concerns were drowned out as the gilded figure stepped forward, raising the burning golden katana to the sky to the cheers of the Cyrodiilic legions. Dressed in the Emperor's gilded plate armour, and his features hidden behind the mask fashioned in the likeness of the first Mede Emperor, Kaius felt the strangely comforting weight of the Daedric sword Goldbrand as he held it aloft for the army to see. The cheers and the sudden wave of confidence was felt more than heard as the legions saw their emperor standing with them. He ignored them, staring off at the sight of a white gold tower rising into the sky several kilometers distant. Its height and majesty had always inspired awe within him. Today, however, it was a symbol, an objective to be taken, rendered hazy and indistinct in the dust of hundreds of thousands of soldiers preparing for battle. Inhaling deeply, he could feel his fangs pressing into his lips, hidden behind the funeral mask of an old friend, an ancestor to the man whose identity he was impersonating. But it didn't matter. The legions needed to know their emperor was with them, and with an increasingly savage but hidden grin he thrust the sword higher into the sky, bellowing a pair of words for all to hear. Dover and Victor! 60,000 soldiers and hundreds of thousands of camp followers, labourers, engineers, healers and army supporters returned the legion's battle cry, tearing leaves from trees with its fury. It was a cry of war, a cry that rolled over the lands of Cyrodiil where it was heard and then taken up by the other 2 armies marching on the city. 200,000 men and women of the 38 imperial legions began marching to war, their disciplined tread shaking the ground and resounding with the approach of destiny. Chapter 4. The Dead Don't Weep. The Throat of the World. Winter. Year 202 of the 4th Era. Present day. The hour was late as Kaius opened his eyes and looked into the flames crackling softly before him. As it seemed to do so, his mind had been wandering through the depths of his thoughts. Every year he had lived weighed heavily upon him, and the deaths of friends and family were fresh as the day that they had passed into Aetherius. Boris, Joffrey, Belisarius, Alexei, 3 emperors, several counts, and numerous acquaintances from the lowliest baker to kings and queens and beyond had come and gone, and yet he remained. Viconia was far away, despite her proximity to his waking thoughts, and he knew that if it hadn't been for her, he would no longer be lingering in the world. A branch snapped as its flame-weakened mass broke in two, and a storm of embers rose into the sky only to be snatched away by the wind. It was howling around the tiny alcove in the cliff face, threatening and promising death and hypothermia, but such concerns didn't even enter his mind. The cold of the mountain was nothing to the cold of his own thoughts, and the frozen core of his soul. For so long he had crushed his emotions and thoughts that it was only through battle that seemed to bring him any joy anymore. Within the recesses of his soul and mind he felt a familiar presence coil around, the burning rage and anger of the presence somehow pleading with him. It was a presence he had felt ever since that fateful day he had stepped through a burning oblivion portal to meet his destiny head-on, and had been part of him for over 200 years. Since the Great War, though, it is much, much more insistent and audible, if such a thing could even be described as such. A vampire is the devourer of the soul, and the hundreds, if not thousands, of throats he had drunk from had filled him with tiny fragments of life force that had merged with his own. Some had faded into nothing, consumed and dominated by his variation of the rape god's curse to empower him. A handful, however, remained, the hints of their personalities and strength remaining where he could call upon them. He could feel the draconic and the daedric presences coiling and scratching at his mind and sanity, but after so long dominating the first soul fragment he had ever consumed. Scaled and as ancient as the bones of the mountains he sat upon, the pair slithered within him, coiling around themselves and whispering half-heard phrases in a language older than time itself. Spindly and corrupt, the arachnid presence kept its own company, choosing to instead to rail against the confines of its soul prison and howl its wordless outrage and despair. Promising power and ruin upon his foes, the ever-present daedric presence spoke to him directly as it had done so for centuries. What he had once known only as the Beast was far more vocal these past years after more of its soul had been consumed. A being that had once been general to a Daedric prince and champion to a Thalmor was now reduced to a pathetic mewling in the back of a vampire's mind, a mewling that was easily ignored from years of practice and a will stronger than steel. The cold seeped into his flesh and he put another log on the fire, pulling his thick fur coat tighter, before leaning over and doing the same to the lithe figure slumbering nearby. As she had for the past 4 months, Sophia was following him on this latest journey, this pilgrimage. It had taken a lot of preparation, considerable coin gained from working with the companions for what they needed for the journey, but they were close to their objective now. For 2 days they had climbed the greatest mountain in Tamriel in Kaius' attempt to respond to the Greybeard's summons, braving the slopes and climbing the 7,000 steps. Normally such a pilgrimage to the Greybeard's monastery in winter would have been impossible or supremely dangerous, but the inadvertent stripping of the mountain slopes of snow and ice from the summons had provided an opportunity. Despite everything and the darkness of his memories, Kaius couldn't help but smile, despite the fact there was as much warmth in his expression as the howling winds outside their stone-walled campsite. Beside him, Sophia sighed softly in her sleep, wriggling deeper under the thick furs of her traveller's bedroll and cloak, to cover herself further from the wind's embrace. Daemones et munti non plorent. The Daedra and the dead do not weep, an ancient Cyrodiilic saying born from the dark days of the Alessian rebellion. The meaning, though, was just as relevant as it had been almost 4,000 years before. The dead, whose suffering is now over and whose souls have moved on to Aetherius, no longer have cause or need to cry, and the Daedra, the creatures and children of oblivion, were simply incapable of doing so. It had once been a phrase spoken in the darkest moments of his life, intended to give hope and purpose to him, to provide confidence and comfort in the face of so much loss. But now, almost 30 years later, the truth of the phrase was much more personal. When all sorrow and suffering and loss strips away a person's humanity, there is nothing left but raw emotion. But that too is to be stripped away. Their soul is scraped and ripped and worn thin until all that is left is a being hollowed and empty, or consumed with hate and anger. 2 centuries, 200 years of vampirism, the loss of all of his friends, the deaths of his children, his wife, his love, his Mirimsiness, deep within the dark unknown caverns of the world. All hope, love, and pleasure had been taken from him, until he couldn't remember the last time he had cried. The Daedric presence in his soul coiled forward at his roiling emotions, and he could feel his muscles tensing with the promise of untold power, the teeth in his skull tingling with potential change. It whispered a wordless question to him, a formless query framed in scraps of emotion, and he could feel what had once been a Dramora's half-plea, half-promise swirling in his mind. "Shut up, Reeve," Kaius whispered to himself, the soft words stolen by the wind as he turned the coals over with his broadsword, his hand gently squeezing the amulet of Talos as it hung from his neck on its handmade leather loop.